Let's bring in our guest now. Joining us from Augusta, Virginia is Han Park. He is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Global Issues. From Medford, Massachusetts is Sung-Yoon Lee. He is the Kim Korea Foundation Professor in Korean Studies at Tufts University. And in Washington, Robert Manning, a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Thanks all so much for joining us. Sung-Yoon Lee, let me start with you. You agree with those who say this is all just too good to be true. Only Kim Jong-un can really win. How so?
Well, if I'd not seen this movie play out before, at least 3 times in the past, I may be less skeptical and more optimistic. The theatrics, the optics were gripping. The 2 leaders of the 2 Korean states shaking hands, walking hand in hand, side by side, affectionately, to and fro across the border. All that is very good, and all the positive pronouncements are very reassuring, if not for the fact that they're nothing new. We have heard it before: end the Korean War, no more war in the Korean Peninsula, peace park along the DMZ, peace maritime zone, complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Why would North Korea, after that banner ballistic year in 2017, all of a sudden change its tune from molto agitato to placido and agree to completely give up its nuclear weapons? It's obviously another phase, another round in North Korea's decades-old strategy.
Okay, Han Park, are you on the same page, or do you think we should celebrate these dramatic steps?
I think we should celebrate, but with reservations. The present situation is different from any time in the past. 2007, they produced a similar agreement, even more progressive agreement, even suggesting that we will overcome, transcend ideological and system differences. That wasn't the case this time around. But now there are a couple of things greatly changed. One is North Korea has decided officially to shift the emphasis from security to economic development. Kim Jong-un, if he cannot produce economic prosperity, his regime legitimacy is at danger. So that's one big change. And second change is we have a big shift in Washington. So Donald Trump, no one knows sure, but he is a very ambitious person, and he would like to mark a historical achievement.
Okay.
So these things are different variables that we face today that we haven't had in the past.
Okay. Robert Manning, do you feel good about this going forward, or do you think Kim Jong-un just has too much to win and Trump ultimately could stand to lose here?
I think it could get ugly fairly quickly, but let me step back a minute and ask the question, why is this happening now? And I think it's happening now, as the other gentleman said, there's some new circumstances. First of all, you have unprecedented economic sanctions squeezing the North Korean economy, running out of cash, causing internal problems. Number one. Number two, I don't think the North Koreans ever thought that China would enforce sanctions to the degree they are. And number three, I think that Kim is terrified of Trump's military threats and is worried that he might actually do something. On the other side, on the North Korean side, what's new is after 6 nuclear tests and almost twice a week missile tests for the past couple of years, Kim feels more confident that he has a strategic deterrent, and he's approaching these talks with that sort of confidence. You saw it in Seoul in the DMZ talks. You've seen it in his comments, his offers, and again, the offers he's put on the table are much less than they appear to be. For example, Kim said he's completed his nuclear program, so the idea of not doing any more testing because he didn't need to, not because he's doing us a favor. Number two, the nuclear test site is about to collapse on itself. There was a study last week by Chinese seismologists that suggest maybe if they did one more test, the whole thing would cave in.
Right.
And so he's making a virtue of necessity. I think it's brilliant diplomacy. And I think the U.S. is kind of caught flat-footed on this because it's not clear what our response is. And the response so far, yeah.
I mean, let me ask Sung-Yoon Lee about that, particularly about this report that this nuclear site is about to fully collapse. I mean, does that leave North Korea negotiating here from an actual position of weakness, but a perceived position of strength internationally, which is what Kim Jong-un effectively wants?
It seems to me it's all about the optics. North Korea doesn't need to conduct a 7th or 8th underground nuclear test. It does, however, need to one day conduct a nuclear test, the hydrogen bomb test, in the Earth's atmosphere in outer space, as the US and the former Soviet Union used to quite routinely in the late 50s and early 60s, to make the point that North Korea has the capability to marry a very powerful nuclear warhead to an ICBM with which it can nuke any major city in the United States. Why is this happening right now? Well, I'm not convinced that Trump's fiery rhetoric really compelled Kim Jong-un to change, because fire and fury, that threat came in August 8th last year. 3 weeks later, Kim Jong-un fired a missile over Japan, and then 5 days later, on September 3rd, conducted a very powerful hydrogen bomb test. Total destruction, Rocket Man. Those comments came at the UN General Assembly, September 19th. 2 months later, Kim Jong-un fired the most powerful ICBM to date for his nation. So that behavior doesn't strike me as the behavior of a frightened man. Rather, he's been planning for all this all along.
Help me understand here. When you talk about the optics, because what's very important for the North Korean leader is how this plays out at home. I mean, it seems like he has existed because of his enemies. He has had North Korea under this constant threat that he has to protect the North Korean people from enemies that are surrounding them, threatening them, be it Japan, be it the United States, be it South Korea. For him to go out in front of the entire world and the North Korean people and suddenly shake hands and make friends with the very enemies that he was there to protect the North Korean people from, I don't understand how that plays out well optically for him in North Korea.
When his father, Kim Jong-il, received the South Korean president in Pyongyang in 2000, and then his predecessor in 2007, or when the grandfather received various foreign visitors from America, officials, journalists, and academics in the 70s, they made the point that these are tributary missions. These people are coming to recognize the great leadership of the great leader and so forth. So not only is the regime not really accountable to public opinion at home, they have a way of sort of spinning, putting a positive spin on this outreach program. Trump really needs to ask himself a basic question. At what point between February 9th and March 8th did Kim Jong-un's intentions go from insincere, a charade, to genuine? February 9th is when Mike Pence invalidated North Korea's outreach to South Korea, calling it a ploy, a charade. And March 8th is when Trump impulsively agreed to Kim Jong-un's proposition for a summit.
Okay, and then I'd like to ask Han Park a similar question then. I mean, how can Kim Jong-un go from being a man holding hands with Moon Jae-in, racked with emotion, this sensitive soul who celebrates one people, when just months before he was talking about the annihilation of the United States? Who is he?
Any country, any system will have different objectives of policy over time. North Korea has shown different objectives. One, regime formation; two, security; three, now economic prosperity. So these things will occur at different points in time in countries' evolution. North Korea right now at a stage where they must induce economic growth, for which the security kind of policy in the past will not work, would not have worked. But now they have tested on 6 occasions the nuclear bombs and multiple times missile tests. Now they declared that this domestic audience, that they accomplished the security, they accomplished the regime formation. Now it's time to move to economic prosperity.
Okay. Okay.
So this is part of the beginning of the economic prosperity policy.
Okay, Robert Manning, briefly, if you can, I need you to comment
Yeah.
on who you think these dual personas of Kim Jong-un actually are. And then I'd like to go on to issues that the piece discussed. Go ahead.
I think there is a bit of something new going on. Don't forget, he's only 34 years old. He's thinking, I want to be around for a few decades. And the fact that they published a declaration in the North Korean press, they referred to Moon as president of South Korea, which they've never recognized. I think there's some interesting straws in the wind. What they mean, we don't know yet. But I think people have really underestimated Kim Jong-un as a very clever politician and diplomat.
Okay. Robert, I'll stay with you for a minute because I want to move on to one of the pillars of this meeting on Friday and what was revealed, and that was the agreement to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. But how do we define denuclearize? Let me ask you point blank, how does North Korea define denuclearize? What do they want to see specifically?
Well, in the past, when they use the term denuclearize, they mean after the U.S. Removes its strategic forces from the Korean Peninsula, ends the alliance, ends the nuclear umbrella over South Korea, then they'll denuclearize. That's pretty much how they've defined it in the past. Whether there's something new going on or not, we don't know. The closest we've got to defining it was the 2005 joint statement where the North Koreans for the first time told us exactly what they want. Energy aid, economic assistance, U.S. normalization, security guarantees, and a peace treaty. But that treaty fell apart because they refused the transparency requirements of verification.
Okay.
So it's not clear what they mean by denuclearization, and frankly, the only way we can find out is by testing them.
Okay. Han Park, do you think you know what North Korea means? And will they eventually insist that the almost 30,000 U.S. troops or so that are in South Korea leave the region?
Kim Jong-un in North Korea may be weird, but they are not unconventional. They are like any other country. They are like any other leadership. Now they want economic growth, for which they must have diplomatic normalization with the United States and South Korea and so forth. That's what they're doing. And the fact that they seemingly are interested in denuclearization suggests that this country should be viewed as a normal country. The IAEA should be involved and may be involved in verification, in counting the number of weapons and so forth. But North Korea is going to be and has to be subjected to IAEA's inspection, the general inspection, not the special inspection.
Okay. Sung-Yoon Lee, I mean, we've heard some of the perspective on what perhaps the North is expecting here. I'd like you to speak from the U.S. perspective, if you can. What will the U.S. be willing to do militarily, in a sense, to reach an agreement with North Korea?
North Korea seeks a denuclearization negotiation process, not actually a resolution. And this is no secret. When North Korea speaks of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which is a strange phrase when you think about the fact that there are no nukes in South Korea, North Korea doesn't say denuclearization of North Korea. This phrase made its debut in the September 19, 2005 joint statement out of the six-party talks. It was an unnecessary concession, and American policymakers blithely repeat that formulation, and North Korea frankly, tells you what they mean by it. As Mr. Manning said, dislodging the U.S. nuclear extended deterrence from the region, the abrogation of the U.S.-South Korea treaty, and the eviction of all U.S. troops from South Korea. That is exactly why Kim Jong-un is saying now, as did his grandfather and father, that, oh, I understand that the U.S. troops in South Korea play a constructive, stabilizing role, so I'm in no rush. I'm not calling for their immediate withdrawal. And then the outsider is dazzled by the North Korean dictator's reasonable line of thinking and comes away convinced that he has gained some great insight into the nature of the regime, mostly by virtue of his own charisma and empathy. And that is exactly what I see happening with respect to President Trump, who, moved by hubris and underestimation of the so-called rocket man in Pyongyang, will meet with Kim, hear pleasing things, and then come away ready to make more concessions, prematurely relaxing sanctions, and basically giving North Korea whatever it wants, as George W. Bush, whom we remember, who was no ardent admirer of the Kim regime, but did just that in 2006 in the wake of North Korea's nuclear tests.
Okay, let me just wrap up here with Robert Manning. I mean, you've heard what Sung-Yoon Lee thinks Trump can do going forward. Do you have a little more confidence then in that he is the president to kind of lead this peace process forward?
Well, the first thing I have to say is everything that's been going on has turned diplomacy on its head. These summits usually happen at the culmination of a process, not at the beginning. I don't think President Trump is planning on giving away the store to North Korea. I fear the opposite, that they're going to demand North Korea give up their nukes before we do anything, and that's equally unreasonable and will not happen. And then we'll be back to the kind of standoff we were before all this parade of peace began. So that's my concern.
Okay.
When NSC advisor Bolton goes on television and talks about a Libya model, what's the message to North Korea? Gaddafi gave up his nukes and he was overthrown. So that's exactly the opposite type of message they should be hearing from us.
Okay, Robert Manning, we're going to have to leave it there with your thoughts. I'd like to thank you all three so much for joining us on this edition of the Newsmakers.